tonight we get into the Roman Empire, but notice the dates. 27 BC to 476 AD, okay? You may say, well, that's the Roman Empire, wasn't it before that time? Well, we really divide the Roman time periods into two time periods. There was a time period of Roman Republic. In about 509 BC, the Romans kicked out their king, said, enough of you, we cannot stand monarchies anymore, and we're going to try something called a republic. Well, of course, they didn't call it a republic at the time. They called it that later on. But they actually started voting for representatives that represent them in government. Of course, that is very, very important to our political situation today because we have a democratic republic. Sometimes we vote directly for things. Other times we vote for representatives who help us, you know, in, well, I should hope they help us, in Congress and legislatures, etc. All right, no laughter there. Okay, so, and you might look at this and say, wow, you know, some of this stuff looks a little Greek-like. And you're right, because even though Rome conquered Greece, Greece conquered Rome, culturally speaking. It Hellenized the whole world. Greece, the Greek language became the language of the Roman Empire. If you wanted to be a business partner, you know, from one end of the empire to the other, you learned Greek, because that's what most people are going to talk. They're not going to speak Latin, which was the original language of the Romans. Why did that happen so much? Because when the Romans conquered Greece, they found out they were brilliant. They found out that they were knowledgeable. They found out about their mathematicians and their philosophers and their astronomers and all those kinds of things. So they brought those Greek slaves over to Rome and had their children taught by them because they were so educated. And then their children were raised up knowing Greek ways. Now also, you might say, wow, lots of Greek buildings. In fact, some of those look like the buildings I would see in Washington, D.C. Absolutely correct again. This is the Roman Forum, and you can see the influence of the Greek architecture upon them with the pediment, that little triangle thing up there, the columns. You got a Corinthian column, you got an Ionic column, you've got a Doric column, and you've got all sorts of colonnades and things like that. So that looks very Greek-like. This next one looks very Roman-like. This is what the Romans brought to architecture. You see on the upper left, that's the Pantheon, which you have the Greek structure in the front and the dome structure, which is Roman, in the back. And then you have the archway, and you notice that in left bottom with that aqueduct, which, by the way, is still standing today. That's an amazing thing. And the Colosseum over there. And then the Arch of Titus. Now, remember this? You saw the Arch of Titus before, if you didn't remember it. It's right, okay. And I have to do this slowly. Alicia said people could not see where I was going around. All right, so right here, I was doing it too fast. That is the Arch of Titus right there in the Roman Forum. And that's going to come up later on because there's a relief on the Arch of Titus which has to do with the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so we will talk about that later on. So here it is right there. All right, let's go on. And major events in Roman history before Christ was born, okay? So what we're going to do is we're just going to run through the Roman Republic. And there was a very important time period when the Republic ended and it turned into an empire. That does not mean for one moment that the Roman Republic did not go out every spring with its consuls and its generals and conquer. They were imperialistic from the beginning. They were conquering all the time. But they were not ruled by an emperor. They were basically ruled by the Senate. And they had tribunes in another group, just like we have, you know, a legislative body and another type of body and two, you know, houses of Congress, etc. They had the same thing, and we patterned our political situation somewhat off of them in our republic. Okay, so in 509 BC, Rome ends the monarchy, becomes a republic, okay? Then in 264 to 146 BC, they have the Punic Wars. Those were hugely important. If they had lost them, The world might be very, very different. Just like if the Greeks had lost to the Persians, the world would almost certainly be very, very different, okay, especially the Western world. In 146 BC, Rome conquers Greece in the Battle of Corinth. And so that's where they've already had some, dealings with the Greeks before. They've traded with the Greeks before, but now they actually conquer Greece, okay? In 63 BC, Pompey takes Jerusalem. Okay, now you're probably wondering, all right, what's happening in biblical history? In 500 BC, the Persians still control Palestine and the Jews. In 516 BC, the Second Temple is just rededicated and finished by the Jews who have come back under Zerubbabel, okay? Then you have the 400s. That's the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the walls, and the rebuilding basically of the bringing back of the law itself by Ezra and the reading of it. Okay, so you go to the 300s, and during the 300s is when Alexander the Great comes from Greece and defeats the Persian Empire. You got the 200s, and that's during the time of the Ptolemies ruling basically in Palestine or in Judea, and you have religious tolerance. And then you get to the 100s, and during that time the Seleucids beat the Ptolemies, and there is not religious tolerance. You have the Maccabean revolt, and from about 140s all the way until 63 BC, the Jews are basically independent, taking advantage of the fact that the Seleucid Empire that was controlling them is falling apart, okay? And Cleopatra and Mark Antony are down in Egypt creating all sorts of havoc in the Roman area and the Roman lands that have been taken, because Egypt has already been taken, and that's creating a civil war, okay? And so what happens next is Julius Caesar goes off into Gaul, which we today know as France. He conquers that area, writes a book, and becomes really famous, and then comes back, and as he's coming back, the Senate says, do not cross this line. If you do, we are going to be thinking treason. In other words, you don't cross this line with your armies. You are coming back into Roman lands, and that was the Rubicon River. And Julius Caesar had other ideas. He wanted to rule all of Rome, so he crossed the Rubicon, and he fought the senatorial armies. He won. The people loved him. He instituted immediate reforms. He was very, very popular, but he did a bad thing. He declared himself dictator for life. Under Roman law, you could only be dictator for 6 months in an emergency. And he declared himself Roman dictator for life. So a bunch of senators greeted him after an oratory on March 15th, and they knifed him to death. Okay, they assassinated him, even Brutus, his friend, right in the back. Et tu, Brute. And then he gave up. You too, Brutus. All right, so he's assassinated, but he's already adopted his grandnephew, Octavian, as one that he considers to be a real ruling type. He wants somebody to take over after he's dead. Octavian takes some real, he has a real problem with what's been done to his great uncle. And so he starts going out and looking for ways that he can gain control. Mark Antony and Cleopatra, however, in Egypt have fallen in love with each other. It's such a dramatic thing, And they are creating what they want to have an Eastern Roman Empire, while there's a Western Roman Empire. So they want to control the East. In other words, they want to control Greece and Asia Minor. They want to control, and they're envisioning this, all of the Levant area, which includes Judea and Palestine, Syria, Phoenicia, and all of Egypt, and bring back the glory of Egypt as the center of that Eastern Roman Empire. Octavian is not going to have anything to do with it, and so he brings a big bad navy there. Oh, first of all, in between that time, remember, Herod the Great becomes ruler of Judea. He's positioning himself, even been to Rome a couple of times to talk it through with Roman leaders. Okay, but in 31 BC, there is a huge naval battle right outside of a little town called Actium, and Octavian beats Mark Antony and Cleopatra. They both commit suicide, and their love and all this kind of stuff. And Octavian could care less, and he becomes the undisputed leader of Rome, goes back to Rome, has a triumph in Rome. A triumph is when they put you on a white horse, you lead everybody in, and everybody is accepting you and they're receiving you. It's a big thing for a general. So Octavian comes back to that, and he just says of himself, he didn't make the mistake his granduncle made. He said, just think of me as first citizen of Rome. Well, he truly is the first emperor of Rome. And later on, in 27 BC, the Senate recognizes him as the one, as emperor, and they call him Augustus. Everybody turn to Luke 2:1. Everyone turn to Luke 2:1. Okay? And you have this man, Octavian, mentioned in the Bible. Now in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that a census be taken in all the inhabited earth. Okay? Now, if you think the Roman Empire was a horrible empire, that it was an awful, awful empire, that it really was like Assyrians and Babylonians and all that kind of stuff, you're wrong. The reason why the Roman Republic was so successful, and later on the Roman Empire was so successful, is because as they conquered, they offered their conquered people citizenship. Who was a Jew who was a citizen of the Roman Empire? The Apostle Paul. Why? Because he wasn't born in Judea, which was not a free area. He was born where? He was born in Tarsus, which was in Asia Minor. It was a free city. It was a city that Rome had said, we're not even going to tax you. And so everybody that was born there was considered a Roman citizen. That's why Paul was beheaded and not crucified, because you could not crucify a Roman citizen. Jesus could be crucified. Who else was crucified right about the time Paul was crucified? Paul was beheaded. Peter. Why was he crucified instead of beheaded? He was not a Roman citizen. He grew up there. So since Rome offered this grand thing of citizenship, people felt a part of this grand empire. Now, there was a problem that Rome was going to have with Jews, because to them, every area they conquered, they had that group of people that they conquered had to worship the gods of that group, but they also had to worship the Roman gods. Because if you worship the gods of your land area, and then you worship the Romans' god, then the whole land would be happy, and the whole land would be peaceful. So to them, this religious tolerance was perfect. You get your religion, we have our religion, but you also have to, and they just took all of the gods of the Greeks and renamed them Roman gods, and then worshiped those, basically, okay? And in doing so, people bought into that everywhere, except in Judea, okay? So you're going to have a problem there. All right, and then in 27 BC, Octavian becomes Augustus. He is the Caesar. That's after Julius Caesar, okay? And this period of Roman Republic, according to historians, ends right there. Empire begins, and that's going to go all the way to 476. Now, you got Jesus born sometime before 4 BC. And you say, okay, how can he be born before? But BC means before Christ. How's he born before he's born? Okay. Well, one of the Pope's individuals that was reckoning time later on and wanted to reckon time by Jesus, okay, did not do enough reading of Josephus. Josephus puts Herod the Great's death at 4 BC, okay? So that would put him dead before he tried to kill Jesus, all right? And so as a result of being off because of the Julian calendar, then what happens is that we have to go back and refigure some of these dates. So for a long period of time, they had Jesus being born 1 AD, okay? But really, he's got to be born before Herod dies. And if we believe in the Bible, and we absolutely do, that Herod was trying to kill kill little babies in Bethlehem before he died, and if we believe Josephus's record, and there are other records indicating that Herod died in 4 BC, when you look at it, then you got to have Jesus born a little bit before there. Maybe 6 BC, and he was about 2 years old, is what I think when they tried to kill all the babies in Bethlehem, okay? Who knows? We don't know. Maybe, he's 2 years old when he's visited, okay, by the Magi, I believe, okay? When they were trying to kill the babies, I'm not quite sure. All right, are there any questions about these major events before Jesus comes on the scene? So he's born into the Roman Empire. A Roman emperor, the very first one, Caesar Augustus, is in power. And he says, we're going to take a census, we're going to know how to tax people correctly, and so Joseph and Mary have to go back to the place of their birth, and that's Bethlehem, and that's where Mary had the baby Jesus. Okay, this is what the Roman Empire looks like at its height in 116 AD under the Caesar called Hadrian. Every colored part that is not a neutral color, they own. That's the height of the Roman Empire. Okay? All right. And this is a map of Palestine under the Herods. It really wasn't called Palestine by this time. We're going to find out how it got its name Palestine today. Okay? It was called Judea, Perea, Samaria, Idumea, as you can see all that, Decapolis, Galilee. It was called all the places that the New Testament talks about. The New Testament never calls it Palestine because it wasn't called Palestine at that time. The Old Testament never calls it Palestine because it was never called Palestine. Historians often refer to it because it had so many names. It had Canaan, and then it had Israel, and then later on it was named Judea, and then it had this, and then it had that. And so just referring to it as Palestine sometimes helps people just know the land area. But that's yet to happen in our chronology, okay? And there you've got Octavian. He's a good-looking guy, you know. He is a pretty heavy-duty general, too. But a person who actually did not want to kill his own, relatives to get, some sort of more power. He was not out there killing the generals that were against him unless he absolutely had to. He went all the way to Africa. This is a good guy. He went all the way to Africa and just looked at the army that was saying, we don't want to be Octavian's, we don't want to be true to Octavian. And he just looked at him and had a conversation with him. He says, you don't want to do this. You just don't want to do this. And looked at the generals and said, just lay down your arms right now and everyone goes peacefully. And they did. He talked them into it, and they didn't have to fight, and those generals stayed alive. And so Octavian gained high regard, not only among the Senate, but among the people. And this begins what we call often the Pax Romana, which is Latin for the peace of Rome, which lasted about 200 years. There could not have been a better time for the gospel to go. God pulled the fullness of times perfectly. Daniel knew that it was during this kingdom that the church would be born, that the gospel would be spread, okay? He prophesies about that. The Romans built roads everywhere. They were the greatest road builders that the world has ever known. Besides, I think the Americans who are really good at it as well. Okay, but the Romans were so great that the Appian Way, one of their Roman roads, is still there and used today. Okay, but they built it so their armies might get places real quickly. So when Paul and the others traveled, the seas were calm and not pirated. The roads were not, full of robbers and everything. You could go from place to place to place, and it was generally speaking peaceful, except for the Jews. They just couldn't get along with the Romans. They had a problem, okay? Herod begins building and renovating the temple. Now, here's why Herod's called the Great. He's not called the Great because he's a great guy. He's an awful guy. He killed his mother. He killed a whole bunch of people. He killed his wife and married another one and named her the same name of his previous wife. he's a bad guy, okay? He's an Idumean, which all the rest of the Jews were saying, we don't like this guy. So what did Herod do in order? I mean, he was shrewd. That guy was smart. Okay, you got to give him that. What did he do in order to gain the acceptance of the people, of the Sadducees and the rest of them? Well, this is what he did. He knew that Rome wanted to make Jerusalem the farthest outpost in the Eastern Roman Empire that was a trading center, a model Roman Greek city, okay? But he also knew he wanted the Jews to love him. He really wanted to be loved. In fact, he was so manic in that regard that he ordered the death of really important people when he died so that there would be mourning at his death, because I think he kind of figured he'd made so many enemies that everyone was going to cheer. Thankfully, his order was not carried out, and all of those very important people when he died were not killed. Okay, but he wanted to be loved, so he starts rebuilding the temple like it has never been built before. Everyone go to Matthew 24 right now. Matthew 24. Okay, after Jesus does the 23 woes against those Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and the rest of them, okay? All right, listen to what he says. Just go back in 23 for just a moment. Listen to what he says in verse 34. After he woes them, just like an Old Testament prophet would woe the people and say, this is your condemnation. He says this, verse 34, therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you, this is huge, you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth. Earth usually in this sense means land. The land of their, that they had been given by the fathers. From the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. There's the prophecy right there. I'm telling you right now, and he says it clearly to them. And he's preaching like a prophet here. It's going to come upon you, and this generation will not pass away until that happens. You will pay for all this blood and the blood of those that you will kill during this time period, of those that are trying to preach to you good news. And those Jews who hated Christians, they joined together with Rome in an unholy alliance to kill Christians during that time period. And Revelation talks about those who were the martyrs that are crying, and their cries are going up to God, and they're saying, how long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood? And they were told just a little longer. And then, of course, what's going to happen is what we will be talking about today. But that temple that he started before he died, those renovations went all the way to 65 AD. And when that temple was built, continued and beautified, it was probably the most beautiful temple complex in the world. This is what one artist said it looked like. All of that, ladies and gentlemen. See the temple in the background? That's the temple in the background right there. This is the temple proper. All of this was considered the temple complexes. Look at Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus came out after then he says his lament for Jerusalem. He's up on a hill looking over Jerusalem right now, and he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to her. How often I wanted to gather you as children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left desolate. What does house there mean to a Jew? Your house. What did Solomon call that temple? That's the house. Your house is going. What did Daniel say would be in Daniel 12:12? What did he say would be an abomination of desolation? Okay? Jesus is saying, just like he said, your house is left desolate. There's going to be an abomination. Jesus is later on going to say in verse 15 of chapter 24, when he warns those who believe in him, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. He gives them every idea and every clue here in Matthew 24 what you've got to do. So as these disciples walk outside and walk toward, they're saying, look at this marvelous building that's going on. It's going on right during their lifetime. It's not been finished yet. Look at all the beautiful buildings, Jesus. And he says, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away with his disciples. When they came to the point out of the temple buildings, they came to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. Fascinating. Jesus prophesies that that temple's going down in 65 AD. That temple renovations are finished in 66 AD, the Jews revolt. In 70 AD, that temple is down, and every part of it. And Titus didn't want it to go down. He knew that this was one of the most beautiful cities that the world had ever seen. Another artist's rendition of Jerusalem during Jesus' time. A jewel of the East is what they called Jerusalem, the trading center. They needed it. The Roman Empire needed it to be highly fortified and very, very well kept and looking beautiful and everything else. And so when Herod said, I'm going to make a name for myself, he said, Rome, can I have some money to rebuild this place and make it fortified and all that? Because you know you got that Parthian Empire out there that's starting to grow, and you've got a treaty with them, but you never know when they might take advantage if Jerusalem looks weak. Roman Empire says, we're going to empty the treasury for you. Jerusalem must have looked spectacular by the time that the Roman armies had to destroy it. And we'll talk about why they had to destroy it later on. Okay? So here are some Roman emperors, the first 10. All right, you've got that in your notes. You got Augustus, 31 BC to AD 14. I say 31 BC even though he wasn't proclaimed Augustus because he basically won the battle in 31 and everybody knew that he was going to be that guy. Tiberius is during the time when Jesus dies. That's when Pontius Pilate is named procurator in Jerusalem. By the way, a procurator means this. I taught this in 6th grade history class. They would say there are two kinds of Roman provinces. There was the one province where you had a governor. Everybody was calm, and everybody liked the Roman Empire. And you know, that one was just ruled by the Senate. And then you had another province, which you called an imperial province. And it was ruled directly by the emperor because it just wouldn't behave. You know, during Jesus' time that there were some insurrectionists. One of them was called Barabbas, who was a murderer. They were doing it then. They did not get ruled well, and they wouldn't put up with being ruled. And one of the things that Herod did that infuriated them is after a while he wanted to keep building. He's building all over Palestine at this time. He's just not building in Jerusalem. I don't have time to tell you all he's building, but everything he built and made beautiful, Caesarea, you know, the port city and all this kind of stuff, this was just amazing what he was doing, but he needed more money. So after a while he thought, I wonder if I can dip into that temple tax. I just wonder if I can do that. Well, that made him really, really mad. And later on, one of his ancestors is going to do that. And that's going to just send the Jews crazy. They're going to go nuts on that one. Okay? They're not going to like that at all. Anyway, Caligula, 37 to 41, a pretty awful ruler. Claudius, pretty awful ruler, 41 to 54. And then Nero, the most awful ruler that you could have, going around killing his mother again and other people like that. And he most likely, according to most historians, set fire to Rome and then blamed the Christians. And when he did that, he just wanted to make everybody really happy about killing people that were like Christians. So Jews, you know, Peter, Paul, they got executed during Nero's time. So it was during this time that the Jews revolted. They grabbed hold of Jerusalem in 66 AD, and they basically thought they were going to reenact that whole Maccabean revolt thing where they won. I think they knew their history well, and they thought, well, there's a lot of problems going on in Rome. There were. The people were going to kill Nero before he committed suicide. He committed suicide before they get to him because they were sick of his rule. They couldn't stand him. Now, notice the number of rulers right after Nero. Galba, 1 year, maybe 2. Otho, not even a year. Vitellius, not even a year. Okay, and then you get some stability when Vespasian comes there. Because of all of that, the Jews that took over Jerusalem were encouraged to rebel against the Roman Empire. Okay, and it keeps going down to Titus, and both Vespasian and Titus are going to come in to what we're going to be looking at. So, Roman leaders affecting biblical events, Julius Caesar, because Augustus Caesar was related to him, and Augustus Caesar was the emperor when Jesus was born. Pontius Pilate, who was sent there directly by Tiberius, because this was not a senatorial province, this was an imperial province, and you had to have a procurator there, okay? Others were, of course, Nero, who killed both Peter and Paul, executed them, Emperor Vespasian, and General Titus, whom we'll talk about in just a few moments. So here are the events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, okay? First of all, in 64 AD, Nero sets fire to Rome, blames Christians, begins a horrific persecution, which, in history, the Jews did that unholy alliance with the Romans and turned in their Jewish brothers that had turned Christian and converted to Christianity. And so you're going to find in Revelation, we don't have time to look at all of Revelation, but if you read Revelation, you are going to, and I believe that it is a description of what happens during the destruction of Jerusalem for the most part. You are going to see how Jerusalem is called a harlot in that book. And she is called a harlot just like Babylon was called a harlot. And that is like the worst thing you could ever say about the city of God. But by this time, she had prostituted herself to the point where she was no longer doing the things that she should have done. And in fact, they, the Jews themselves, desolated the temple. They desecrated it. They were the abomination of desolation in it, which we'll talk about in a few moments. Okay, 65 AD, the temple renovations are finished. Herod's dead now, but they kept going on afterward. Fall of 66 AD, zealots and other revolutionaries take control of Jerusalem. Infighting and civil war between factions in Jerusalem account for horrific acts of violence and betrayal, weakening the rebels' cause. The problem that they had, which was very unlike the Maccabean revolt, is that they were not all on the same page. Once they grabbed hold of Jerusalem and kicked out the Romans, they had civil war inside that city for the next 4 years. There was the Zealot faction, who were primarily nationalists. There was the Idumean faction, who wanted to be, Herod-like and were Sadducean-like. There were other factions in there that had a different agenda that were kind of going along with with other political situations of the day. You had them all fighting, and they were not going to give an inch to help each other out fight the Romans. So in late 66, early 67 AD, Cestius Gallus, a Roman general from up in Syria, he comes down there to quell this, what was called a rebellion at that time. But by the time he gets there, the Jews are so ready for him that unbelievably, the Romans lost. With all of their tactics militarily, Gallus loses, and 5,700 casualties are claimed, and that's an embarrassment. This is during Nero's time. He is furious with this, and so what he does is he goes and asks the Senate for a declaration of war. Notice he has to ask the Senate for a declaration of war. Who has to ask the Senate for a declaration of war today in our country? The President of the United States, that's right. Okay, early spring 67 AD, Vespasian is commissioned by Nero to end this rebellion after Rome declares war on the Jews. Now it's a war. You did this to one of our legions, it is war. You have a war on your hands. Okay, it continues on. In August of 67 AD, Josephus, a Jewish general who was of the Zealot persuasion, goes against Vespasian as he comes down from the north. And when Vespasian comes down and he intersects, they both intercept each other, they have a battle, Josephus is captured. Now, he could have been slaughtered right there, but Vespasian's a shrewd guy. He knows that Josephus is a smart individual. He recognizes him as a true general of an opponent's army, and he says, we're going to keep you alive as a negotiator. He does such a good job, he convinces Josephus that that beautiful city of Jerusalem is going to go down. And this whole area of Judea is going to be ravaged if this war continues. You want to stop it. Talk those Jews into it. To this day, if you want to talk about a traitor in American history, who do you say? Benedict Arnold. If you want to try talking about a traitor in Jewish history, you know who you say? Josephus. Because he went to their side and he believed in not their cause so much. He believed Jerusalem, the temple, and everything else was going to go down if he couldn't convince his brothers in arms to stop this. So this is huge because Josephus becomes an eyewitness of these first Jewish wars. He is an eyewitness of them all. He is an eyewitness of the destruction of Jerusalem. He is an eyewitness of everything that's done before that time. He is an eyewitness to after the destruction of Jerusalem, and he writes about those wars and becomes a general historian for the imperial court of Rome. This is very, very important. And then he spends the rest of his life trying to reconnect all of history. He writes about Greek history. He compiles things. He probably went to Alexandria and read a bunch there in order to gain his history and proclaim that history, which today is used quite a bit, okay, and especially for the destruction of Jerusalem. In 68 AD, Vespasian reaches the walls of Jerusalem. He first comes into the area and he just thinks, I've heard of the civil war that's going on in that city. They're killing each other. I'm going to kind of just subjugate the rest of the land first and not go to Jerusalem for a while. First of all, I don't really want to have to do a besieging. It's a lot of work and a whole lot of being away from home. Okay? And I know how fortified Jerusalem is. Secondly, if I let them weaken themselves, maybe they'll just surrender. Okay? So here's Vespasian reaching the walls of Jerusalem. Then Nero commits suicide right at that time. So Vespasian has to return to Rome because he's thinking he's going to be the next guy. So he kind of releases, the rebels are going, see, they can't get their act together in Rome. And they get more and more encouraged that they're not going to give up. And so he has to go back to Rome. As soon as he goes back to Rome, he's declared emperor, and he dispatches Titus to Jerusalem, who is his son. So Vespasian begins the besieging, and then has to relax it, but leaves his army there, kind of besieging that city, all right? And then Titus comes back with even more legions and joins with Vespasian's legions, and now they are at Jerusalem's gate. All the rest of Judea has been subjugated. In April 70 AD, Titus besieges the city with all of his ramparts and everything else, and then he begins negotiations. Titus did not want, according to Josephus and every other record that we have, he did not want to destroy that city. It was so beautiful, it was so important to Roman security in the East, he did not want to do it. The fact that Jesus prophesies that that temple is going to go down would be against everyone's bet at that time if they were running around with Titus, watching this guy. In fact, Titus I read, almost got himself killed in negotiations by the treacherous Jews that said, sure, we'll talk to you, and then tried to kill him. Okay, they were just beyond hope at that particular time. So he besieges the city, he begins the negotiations. It just gets awful there. 70 AD, Jerusalem falls, the temple is burned, the city is leveled. But I've got to read to you some things that one man did on the internet, which I think is fantastic. I've read all of Josephus's history of the fall of Jerusalem, but that was years ago. And this guy encapsulates it. Listen to what he says here. Titus divides his army, and they try to attack the first wall and the fortress of Antonia at the same time, but fail. There were a lot of failings in trying to take Jerusalem, by the way. Within 3 days, Titus and his army cast a trench around Jerusalem, and the entire city is enclosed with a new wall 9 miles in length. All available timber within a 10-mile radius around Jerusalem is used. You go to Revelation, it says every green thing dies. There wasn't a tree standing in that area because, number one, they were using it for their ramparts, and number two, you'll see later on, they use it for crucifixions, and they run out of wood. And the entire area is stripped bare of foliage. Titus challenges the Jewish fanatics to let the citizens go, promising that they would receive their houses back in time, but the fanatics instead begin to execute anyone caught discussing the idea of surrender. Their bodies are mutilated and thrown over the wall to the Romans. Titus, making his rounds, sees the valleys full of dead bodies and groans with his hands spread toward the sky, calling heaven as a witness that these deaths were not his doing, but, quote, were the sad case of the city itself. In the city, dead bodies are piled up in heaps, the result of famine and civil war. Some of the mansion houses are used for body depositories. The stench of decomposing bodies fills the cities. Robbers plunder the city houses at will, thrusting some of the starving ones through with their swords for sheer pleasure. However, writes Josephus, those who asked to be killed in order to escape their misery were laughed at and left alone to suffer. Most of them died with their eyes fixed on the temple, as if they hoped until the end that the temple itself could save them. During the siege, many desperate Jews tried to escape Jerusalem, mostly men, sadly, who left behind their wives and children, thinking they alone could escape unnoticed. However, writes Josephus, they were caught by the thousands, whipped, tortured by various means, and crucified just outside the city walls at a rate of 500 crucifixions per day. Titus took pity on these victims, but didn't interfere because he hoped that the inhabitants who could see this going on right over the walls would surrender in order to avoid a similar fate. In the end, being that there weren't enough crosses, scarcely room for all of them in any case, more than one Jew was often nailed to the same cross. Horrific. Unbelievable what's going on. They were eating the dead babies inside because they were starving to death, and they would not give up. Terms of surrender were given to them. You'll all live. You will go into slavery, but you'll live. They were turned down every time, often turned down with violence right over the walls. These people who gained control of Jerusalem were horrific. However, Josephus writes that there was a time when they actually had a moment before the destruction of Jerusalem. Artist's rendition again here. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, they actually had an opportunity to get out. And they remembered Jesus prophesying, when you see the desolation, that desolation, an abomination of desolation, happened in his own house in the temple. And that's when those fanatics got control. They absolutely executed all of the high priesthood inside the city. All the high priesthood, they executed them and set up a different priesthood that would be less Sadducean and more politically right with them. And when they did that, they didn't know what they were supposed to do in the temple. So they often offered sacrifices that were incorrect in there. They were desolating their own house, and they were desecrating it as well. And so when that happened, Christians, they got out of the city. Josephus records it. Eusebius records it in 100 AD. He knows some of the people that probably escaped. He records it, and another historian records it. The Christians escaped and were not harmed because they believed Jesus and the rest of the apostles in telling them what would happen. That is on the relief. That is a relief that's on the Arch of Titus. It's on the front cover of your packet. Do you see the menorah, so to speak? Do you see the candlestick? That's from the temple. That's a relief of the procession of Titus's triumph when he went back to Rome. And it's right there on the Arch of Titus, and you can see it to this day if you go to Rome, okay? Then Jewish resistance hadn't stopped. Some of them ran up to Herod's fortress where he thought he would go if he ever had to get away from the people. A fortress high up in what's called Masada. And that's Masada reconstructed on the left. That's what Masada looks like today. And here is the ramp that the Romans used to breach it and get to that Jewish last holdout. And it's just a reminder. You can go, and those are people just walking up the ramp to the Masada area. All 960 of them committed suicide before the Romans could get them. And that was the last of that Roman resistance. So here, no, it lasted from about 70 AD to 73. It was about 3 years that they held out. They had so much water and food and everything stacked in there. So the first Jewish revolt was called the Great Revolt, 66 to 73 AD. Now, in about 3 minutes, I'm going to finish. I want you to know this, okay? That was the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and Josephus records the death of 1.1 million Jews. Some people say that can't be possible. I don't know. 97,000 of them were sold into slavery. They weren't done yet. The Jews revolted again in Cyprus and Cyrene in 117 and 118 AD. And at this time, 460,000 of them were killed on both of those islands, and unknown numbers in Egypt, Libya, and other eastern Mediterranean areas. Remember, the diaspora was everywhere. Jewish people were everywhere. So this was probably another million that were killed in a genocide type of situation. And then the last one was in 132 to 136 AD, and it happened again inside of the area of Judea. And it resulted in the depopulation of almost all Jewish communities in Judea. That means that most historians think this was genocide again. They just killed everybody off. Romans renamed Judea Palestina after the Jews' ancient, rivals, the Philistines. That's where the word comes from. So they were so angry by that time. They were so fed up with them that they just said, we're going to rename this area Palestina, from which we get Palestine. Now, this is what happens after that. After that time period, Jews were not even allowed to be in their homeland. Never in Jerusalem. Never. The church continues to grow during the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire falls in 476, but that's only the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire, which is holding Judea and Palestina, is still going on and goes on all the way until 1450 AD. They keep the Greek ideas alive, the Roman ideas. The Western Roman Empire goes into stupidity in what we call the Dark Ages. They all got dumb over there. In the Eastern Roman Empire, it was great. It was terrific. It was going on. However, in the 600s, a man named Muhammad starts a new religion. And that new religion becomes very, very, military-like. And they conquer the area of Palestina. And the Arabs are there. Now, they kind of let the Jews live there that are back in the land. They went back in after the Roman Empire fell, and it was okay. All right, they live side by side. But this area is called Palestina. And for years and years and years, it became the subject of wars. Later on, the Crusades happened. Well, in 1450 AD, when the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople, They basically made their mark on history with what was called the Ottoman Empire, if you remember that from your history courses. And that area was controlled and continually controlled. And all of those very, very Christian areas, like in Asia Minor, were no longer. They became Islamic areas. Palestine was an area that was Islamic until something happened in the 20th century, a thing called World War II and Adolf Hitler. And Adolf Hitler started killing Jews, and when he did that, the Jews all over the world in the New Age diaspora began writing one another. And as they wrote one another, and as people after World War II found out about what was going on, there was a great deal of sympathy toward the Jews. And they started writing one another and say, we can't let this ever happen to us again. We've got to go back to our land, the land God gave us from the beginning. Now, we know as Christians that God broke, he did not break that covenant. They broke that covenant with God, and that's no longer the covenant that they can have the land. But they don't feel that way. So they went back to the land by the hundreds, by the thousands, by the hundreds of thousands, and the Palestinians were going, no, you can't come in, but they couldn't stop them. It started a civil war, and the UN, and especially the United States, politically speaking, sided with the Jews, and in 1948, a new country was born, the modern-day Israel. And from then on, you've got terrorism going on, because in 1967, every Arab country was going to take over Israel and squash it and leave it for, the dead bodies that it was going to be. Syria was in on it, Lebanon was in on it, Jordan was in on it, Saudi Arabia was in on it, Egypt was in on it. They all amassed their troops around with their tanks. And guess who had fitted the Israeli army with a great air force? The United States. So in 6 days in June, the Israelis went to the skies and they just obliterated all of the armies. And so from that time in 1967, you've got this horrific terrorist activity sometimes going on by fanatics of Palestinians that say we don't have a homeland. Okay, and then there's the time that Saddam Hussein does his deed when he goes traipsing into Kuwait and says this was really ours from the beginning, and George Bush says, you're not going to do that. Gets together a coalition and goes and asks Saudi Arabia, can we have airstrips there where we can mount our multifaceted attack on Kuwait and into Iraq? And the Saudi Arabians are so nervous about what's going on in Iraq, they say yes. That to a true Islamist, that to a true Muslim was treachery and it was treason. You don't do that. And so there was a prince in the court of the Saudi Arabian king who absolutely got disgusted by that, because once a Muslim land, it should always be a Muslim land. And to them, the Jews should have never done that. And to go to Saudi Arabia, where the holiest city of the Muslims is located, Mecca, and in that same general area, set up an infidel group of British, French, and American airplanes and airstrips there? No way. He absolutely went nuts, and his name was Osama bin Laden. And so he goes to Afghanistan and starts Al-Qaeda, and a few years later, the Twin Towers fall. And so all of any kind of incursion that the United States makes into these lands, whether you politically think that that's right or wrong, has nothing to do with how a Muslim thinks of it. For most of them, that is an intrusion into their holy land. So how does Abraham have something to do with Osama bin Laden? Because Abraham had two sons
that are of importance. One of them is Ishmael, and from Ishmael come the Arabs, and from the Arabs comes Islam, because Muhammad was an Arab, okay? And the other one was Isaac. And next week and the following week, we will talk more and more about how Muhammad rewrites history, looks back at history and says, Isaac was not the promised son. Ishmael is. And to this day, his followers believe that to be true.